Welcome back, Hnrs. All right, so welcome back to your yet another flip and stuff like that. And you guys did great so far. Talked to several different kids who feel like they're really understanding what's going on and stuff like that with the flip model and things like that. So we finished up today in class talking about the Mesopotamian city-states, right? We kind of reviewed the Sumerians, talked about the Akkadians. We brushed over the Babylonians and stuff, particularly talking about King Hammurabi and his law code and stuff like that. So the big thing, though, is we also talked about the Assyrians and the Neo-Babylonians. Told you the Nebuchadnezzar story, right? Move the world for the woman you love. All right, but look, we're now getting into the Egyptians, right? We're now going to be talking about the Egyptians because our first unit is a complete and kind of more in-depth study of the ancient civilizations of the ancient world and the kind of leading up to the Greek period. Now, if you didn't know this or not, our big augmentation for our class is the fact that y'all have a unit on the front of your stuff that the other classes don't. So they go straight into Greece. We have a unit before that, and then we catch them and pass them by the end of the year, right? So just to give you a heads up, that's how everything kind of finagles and how it all works, all right? So, but the big thing is, though, is now that we're moving into the Egyptians, we talked about it a little bit in class. I tried to kind of throw out a couple of words that y'all know about ancient Egypt and stuff like that, and y'all are like, oh, it's in Africa, oh, it's in the Nile, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. It's very, very good. And somebody said mummies, too, which, you know, is a very big thing, but check this guy out. Oh, come on. Ah! All right, but that's like King Tut right there. Man, he has seen better days. He's very crispy now, very crusty and stiff. He's about 3,000 years old, so that's what you would look like, too, if you were about 3,000 years old. I feel like it would probably be better off to just not look like this after a couple thousand years. But the big reason why I wanted to show you this is just to start off is the fact that, the Egyptians are known by more than just mummified bodies, King Tut, and a couple of little ancillary things that you may have heard of when you were younger. It actually is a very in-depth culture that has a lot to do with its environment, and also it's very good to parallel next to the Mesopotamians because they're just so different. And it's really interesting because they're both the two largest areas for civilizations during this time period. But as you can see, the ancient Egyptians are going to basically, in a nutshell, last from about 3100 BC to about 653 BC, give or take, right? So actually probably even a little bit further than that, getting into the fact that Alexander the Great then eventually took them over. And Egypt is still today a modern-day country and a culture and a people and a language and all this other stuff. So they're still around, but we're mainly going to be focusing on the ancient aspect and kind of what made them unique. So in this very first flip, we're not talking about specific historical things that happened. Tomorrow we'll get into the more minutia, little small-scale details. We'll talk about the 7 different time periods. We'll move through those time periods. We'll talk about another guy in a minute that we'll also bring up again multiple times. His name's Meanies, but we'll get there, all right? So getting into it, though, the first thing that we're talking about in this flip is actually the cultural commonalities that all Egyptians share, right? So the big thing that we noticed when we were studying the Mesopotamians is that Sumerians were similar but still different from Babylonians. Similar but still different from Akkadians. Similar but still different from Neo-Babylonians. Now, to focus on these things really, really quick, though, the Egyptians are also unanimously similar, right? The Egyptian kingdom had a culture all its own, one language, one government system, one leader, and a lot of other facets. So their culture spanned their entire area, and it was universal. It was completely ubiquitous. From top to bottom, Egyptians did all the same things. We got to kind of get to the point of why that is, and then also we're going to get to the point of why that benefited them and those cultural aspects of what made them so unique. All right, so big thing about it, though, all right, is that where is Egypt, right? Well, I'm going to show you on this map, and I'm going to expect you to remember this tomorrow. Egypt is located right here, all right? So Egypt is located right here in the northeast corner of Africa, and then it connects to Southwest Asia, which then gets into, Israel is located right here, Jordan, Saudi Arabia is right here, and this right here is the Red Sea, right, in the Persian Gulf. Now, going forward, though, the geography of Egypt is very, very important when it pertains to the growth of their society, right? It is located in northern Africa. It is very hot and very arid. The average temperature there usually topping out around 75 degrees year long, but their average summer temperature can sometimes get into the triple-digit hundreds, as in, some of you are like, well, in Louisiana, it gets over 100 degrees. No, I'm talking about in the average summer temperature, it's closer to 110, sometimes tops out at 118 degrees in Egypt, right? So you're living in a very hot, very arid area, but the key to their survival is the Nile River, right? Now, the Nile River is a very, very important river, and you need to remember this off the top of your head. The Nile River is not the longest, nor the widest, nor the this, nor the that river out of all of them. Everybody immediately thinks it's the longest river in the world. It's not. It's the Amazon. Everybody then immediately thinks it's the this river in the world. No, it's not. It's the Mississippi. The Nile is only very, very unique for one particular reason, and that is that it flows from south to north. Okay, so the Nile is the only major river in the world that goes from like the opposite direction, pretty much like universally. It starts down here in the Sudan and then goes all the way up through Egypt and dumps into the Mediterranean, so it actually goes the opposite direction from south to north, unlike the other major rivers of the world that go north to south. So going into it though, unlike the Mesopotamians, they did not fear their river. We talked about this in the last flip. We talked about this in class a little bit. The Mesopotamians feared their river. They feared natural disaster. They feared floods. They feared catastrophic events that could destroy their cities and their peoples. The Nile, on the other hand, by the Egyptians, was actually looked at as a key to survival and was considered the most life-giving thing on the planet to them, right? They praised it. They actually thought that it was the thing, the essence of their life. And as you can see with this satellite image, it is, right? So this right here is Egypt externally against the Nile River, right? The Nile is this giant oasis of greenery right here that cuts through this giant desert terrain in northern Africa, right? So as you can see, this river, this artery, is a gateway and a life giver to this entire civilization, so they praised it. They did not fear it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that every September, like clockwork, the Nile floods, right? So every September, the Nile would flood, and every November, the waters would retreat, okay? It's very important that we all remember the fact that the Nile flooding is a key importance to the life of ancient Egyptians, right? The fact that it would flood and break its banks every single, September, the flood waters would then slowly revert. And what would be left is all this mushy mud stuff that actually is left on the banks, and it fertilized the earth, making it very, very easy to grow crops in ancient Egypt, right? And that stuff, that squishy material, that life-giving substance from the bottom of the river is known as silt, all right? So silt, S-I-L-T. And I don't know what it is, but I remember that word silt from like 3rd grade. I remember learning about this stuff, this bits of rock and mud and decomposed material that gave lifeblood to the Egyptian kingdom. Also, when I was a kid, I thought Egypt was fascinating, so I just remember a lot of stuff from it. Now, even before I began to kind of study them, right? Now, silt, though, the reason why it re-energizes the soul and gives it so much life and gives it so much essence is due to the fact that silt contains a lot of dead matter, right? So the bottoms of rivers, the bottoms of waterways typically tend to harbor or carry with it decomposed material, including animals, vegetation, decomposing rock, and mineral deposits and things like that. So it's literally the best stuff on the planet when it comes to fertilization, right? And it's also a big reason why Louisiana farmland for a long time, especially in the New Orleans area, has been so good due to the fact that this is actually used to be a swamp, right? So swamp bottoms, swamp water, or the dirt in the bottoms of swamp was also very, very good when it comes to reinvigorating the soil and things like that. It's why certain plants can grow in the swamps and thrive, whereas they cannot do it in other places. Now, going into it, though, this right here is what you would consider silt. So I don't know if any of y'all have ever actually swam in a river before, but I grew up in North Carolina, and we used to swim in rivers and stuff like that. Had a very, very country, very rural upbringing. And when I was little, I remember used to sticking my hand into the bottom of a river, and I would pick this stuff up out of the water, and I would try to lift it out of the water, and it was so fine, so granular that it would just go whoosh, and just go right through my hands, right? That's the stuff that reinvigorated the soul, and it made it so easy for Egyptians to grow so well, and it's why they began to depend on the river, and they believed that it was a great resource. They also were able to plant directly into this silt on the banks of the river without the use of intense irrigation systems like the Mesopotamians had to use due to the fact that their natural levees guided the rivers in certain directions, and they also didn't want to live on the banks, because if you lived on the banks, then a flood might destroy your entire village. Now, going into it, though, this is what bad land looks like. So as you can see right here, this is dark, rich, deep, deep browns, right? Deep, dark colors. This right here is land that actually exists in North Carolina where I'm from. And as you can see, it's clay because the nutrients and the silt works have been sucked out of it through years and years and years of cotton farming. So why I'm showing you these two pictures is to show you this is what silt provided to the ancient Egyptians. Good fertilizer, natural fertilizer that literally deposited itself on the riverbanks every single September. And this is what happens if you don't fertilize your soil. And this is what happens that, to a lot of other people. Mesopotamians were dealing more with soil like this, whereas the Egyptians were not, right? So going into it, though, You don't need to write this down. Don't write this down. Don't write this down. It's just like kind of an example, a first-hand like source. So really, really quickly, what is this thing that we're about to look at right now? You're going to need to remember this especially for your test. This is a primary source, right? There are two types of sources out there when it comes to historiography. You've got primary sources and secondary sources, right? Your primary sources are things that were said, written, or observed by a person that was there at the time, right? A secondary source is a thing that was written or observed by somebody who lived outside of that time. For example, if I wrote a book about ancient Egypt, mine would be considered an academic secondary source, whereas the words of this guy, Herodotus, is considered a primary source because he is a Greek historian, all right? He is the very first Greek historian. He actually came around in the classical/late archaic period of Greece, and he also was the first person to travel around and actually observe a lot of these different cultures and these different communities, and he did go and observe Egypt. And when he observed Egypt, he actually discovered something very important. And he discovered the works of the Nile, and he discovered how the silt deposited itself, and he discovered the great agricultural aspects of ancient Egypt. And he said in a quote, "Egypt, to which the Greeks go in their ships, is an acquired country, the gift of the Nile." As in, the community and the civilization of Egypt has been blessed upon them by their river, right? At present, it must be confessed that they obtain the fruits of the field with less trouble than any other people in the world. As in, it is easy to grow stuff out on the banks of the Nile River. You stick a seed in that dirt, it just grows. Yaga! And it just like grows, and it's fine, okay? So, and they grew tons of different stuff. Barleys, wheats, grains, a lot of like actual really, really solid staple cereal crops and stuff like that. Not cereal like with your milk and stuff like that, but cereals as in dry crops that they can actually make into things like bread, right? They grew tons and tons of different items, okay? They also used the Nile to fish in and also give them different life sources like that. They also had like hippopotamus running around in it, which I think they're very cute. You say Nierfeld in German to actually say hippo. Now look, so early on though, a lot of y'all are probably thinking to yourself, you're probably not, but it's fine. But I know a kid like, I don't know, maybe a Jernigan, right? No, Jernigan, I've said your name before already. That is true. I need to back off. You pump the brakes. Pump the brakes. Gabby, or Gabrielle, I know that you're probably thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, Mr. Terry, this is in like 3,900 BC or something like that. It's super, super old. It's way, way long time ago. How would it be possible that the Egyptians had a universal culture that went all the way along this river that's hundreds of miles long? Your theories are dumb, and I hate you, all right? So not your theories. I'm saying you're saying my theories are dumb, that you hate me. Now, but the thing about it is, early on, Egypt actually was, you're right, Gabby, was actually divided into two separate upper and lower kingdoms, right? So early on, Egypt was an upper Egypt and a lower Egypt. And they actually kind of function independently of each other. They each had their own king, they each had their own pharaoh. But then a guy came along named Menes, right? M-E-N-E-S. And he united the two kingdoms together in 3100 BC, creating a very large political unit, which would give them a culture that spanned their entire kingdom, right? So upper and lower Egypt were combined together, and you can even see it in this source right here that actually is a secondary source, but it shows you the unification of the upper and lower Egyptian kingdoms. As you can see right here, this was the white crown of Upper Egypt, looks kind of like a bowling pin, and this is the red crown of Lower Egypt, and it looks like a lizard's hiding in there, and it's just like, bleh. And then this right here is the double crown that came around after the unification of the kingdoms, right? So literally the pharaohs would wear a crown that demonstrated the unification of the kingdoms because of the white and the red crown being combined together, all right? That is definitely going to be in your warm-up tomorrow. Excuse me, be ready for it. Now, the thing about it, though, is what did this create? Jot this word down. This event, the unification of the kingdoms, created a centralized state, all right? A centralized civilization. Notice the word I'm using there, centralized, is the important thing. A centralized, completely similar cultured kingdom ruled from one location, okay? So here's the thing you need to understand. Look at all these little red dots. All those little red dots, those are Mesopotamian city-states, right? So as you see, you've got down here, which is one of my favorite ones, as y'all know. You've got down here. You've got different areas like Nippur. You've got other areas in the north that's going to include the Assyrians. You've got Uruk and all these different areas, these different Mesopotamian city-states. These city-states actually operated independently of one another. They had their own governments. They had their own kings. They had their own leaders. They had their own different ideas, whereas Egypt did not. Egypt was ruled from one city, right? Now, it had other cities throughout, Thebes, Cairo, and multiple other cities, but they all reported back to their capital city. Their capital city was called Memphis, all right? Memphis, as in Memphis. Yes, the exact same one as Tennessee, and Tennessee actually named its Memphis off of the ancient Egyptian capital. So that should give you some understanding of that centralized government. They rule from one spot, right? One location, one area. And we'll talk about how the pharaohs did that a little bit later, but the big thing you need to talk about is, wait a second, if a pharaoh is ruling over this giant kingdom, then who takes over when he dies? They operated in a set of dynastic rulerships, right? So the pharaoh belonged to a family, right? And all of those families are marked by numbers, okay? They didn't actually have last names in the sense that we use them today. We actually mark the dynasties by number, right? So for example, the Old Kingdom is the 3rd through the 6th dynasties, right? Whereas the Archaic Kingdom is the 1st through the 3rd dynasties. And the most successful dynasty out of all of them is the 18th dynasty, which actually comes in the New Kingdom, right? So, yeah, it's old, middle, new. All right, so now look. Here's the thing, though. To understand these dynastic rulers and how well they did, like our boy King Tut was a part of one of these dynasties. He was a part of the 18th dynasty. This unification of kingdoms made Egypt adopt this dynastic style of a ruling family. So when a father died, his son took over, right? His son took over and then ruled as this god-king figure, right? This differed from Mesopotamia due to the fact that Nebuchadnezzar and people like Nebuchadnezzar and Hammurabi were military leaders, right? It was all about who had the most power at that given time. And when that person died, probably his son would take over, but it was a matter of time until another warlord came in and took over, right? For example, the Babylonians were conquered by the Assyrians, right, which are led by an individual. And then later on, the Neo-Babylonians drove the Assyrians out, and they were actually led by Nebuchadnezzar, right? So they were all about military warlords, whereas Egypt was not. It was a dynastic leadership under several different families, right? So as in, one family would rule, and they would be the second dynasty. And then when all of them died out, they would select a new family, and that'd be the third dynasty, right? Because there would be some succession crises and stuff like that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But that dynasty, that ruling family, is very important when you're talking about the culture of ancient Egypt. Now, when you're also talking about the culture of ancient Egypt, much like we did when we talked about the culture of ancient Mesopotamia, you oftentimes also have to address their religion and their mythology, right? Now, I think Egyptian mythology is highly underrated, all right? Y'all read probably for English, if you had this year, you read your Greek gods and myths book, right? So like Greek mythology, very, very famous. Everybody can name a bunch of Greek gods, right? You've seen Hercules once, best Disney movie ever. Then you actually can name a bunch of Greek gods, right? But their religion and mythology is a little bit different in Egypt because it went through several phases and then directly relates to their government style. Now, early on, there were two supreme gods, right? They believed in the earliest forms of Egyptian religion that there was Amun, who was the wise god king of the sky, and he was represented literally by a formless figure, and Ra, who was the justified taker of life and the god of the sun. So he's a big circle, right? Like now, Horus apparently was their servant or a demigod who is the falcon of the hunt and war. He's the messenger of Ra. He is the one that would come down and bestow the ability to rule upon kings. So if you were a king, it was believed that Horus came to you and bestowed your ability to rule upon you. So those were their early three gods, three simple ones that actually kind of were like the messenger. And then also another really cool thing is the representation of Egyptian gods. This right here is Horus with his falcon head. So as you can see, they believed that a lot of the lower gods, maybe like some would refer to them as demigods, would actually have a non-human face, right? Would actually have an animal's head and a human's body. Very, very cool looking. My favorite is Anubis. Anubis is the Undertaker and basically their angel of death and like the god of all like mummification and stuff like that. Now, continuing their religion and mythology though, later on, after the unification of the kingdoms, the kings decided the priests of Egypt decided to, they're known as viziers, decided to combine Amun and Ra together. So what ended up happening is they then refer to a supreme god, the god over all other gods, kind of like a Zeus-like figure, but even more powerful, and his name was Amun-Ra, right? And he was believed to embody himself in anything at any time. It would oftentimes come down as a ram or a stag, right? So now he's represented by this, the all-seeing eye of Ra, because the concept would be that he is actually embodied within this like understanding of an omnipotent, omniscient God that sees all things, right? So that right there is the eye of Amun-Ra, and you could oftentimes actually see the presence of Amun-Ra in a king. So every time you saw this is Horus again, right? Every time you saw this sun over top of his head, it basically meant that Ra was talking through Horus because he is this giant, formless, supreme god, and Horus is one of his demigods or one of his smaller gods, right? And they had tons of other gods. They had Thoth, and they had what's his name? Bess. I think his name's Bess. He's like this little tiny little short god who apparently lives in your house whenever your wife's pregnant, and he's the god of fertility. He's also the god of mischief. He knocks things over and stuff. Now, anyway, but we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But the Egyptians, if they believe in a very succinct religious structure, then you have to be able to understand that they have a very intense afterlife structure, okay? So the concept of rulership and godlike power and things like that really relate a lot back to a story that has to do with the Egyptian mythology perspective. Egyptians believed that there was an afterlife. They believed that you would basically be resurrected in a sense after you died, and you would be judged by a very important god, and that god's name is Osiris. And Osiris was the god of the resurrection of the Nile. When it flooded every single year, that was believed to be Osiris and his wife, Isis, bringing those floods about, right? Now, Osiris, apparently, according to the story, was killed by his brother Set, right? And Set was Osiris was just a pharaoh. Just a pharaoh, and he had a big sarcophagus made by his brother Set. And Set was like, oh, hey, buddy, look at this sweet sarcophagus, which is a big coffin I made for you. Why don't you get inside of it, and I want to show you something cool. And Osiris gets in it, and Set kills him and chops him up into a bunch of little pieces and stuff like that, and then throws him in the Nile. But Isis, his wife, then the goddess of the Nile resurrection, brought upon the floods to wash the pieces of Osiris back onto the banks, and then she then reconstructed him and resurrected him as the new god of fertility, and then also the god of the resurrection in the underworld, right? So she is believed to bring Osiris back to life when the Nile floods. So this all relates, as you can see, to their geography, and it also relates to this concept of an afterlife, because after Osiris was resurrected, according to Egyptian mythology, he then ran the underworld, right? So speaking of the underworld, which this all directly relates back to their concept of the afterlife, they believed that to be able to consort with Osiris, discuss and talk to him, move through his presence, and be able to be one with him and go to the afterlife, you needed to be preserved, right? So this is very, very important. The idea is that if your body was not preserved, then you would not be able to go and address Osiris to his face to be judged to decide if you get to go to heaven or not. Their heaven was called the happy field of food. Legit. The Egyptians believed in this concept of a giant field that was full of food all the time. And why would that relate to the environment that they come from? Due to the fact that they're a desert-dwelling people. So, of course, abundance and life and an oasis of afterlife would be their heaven, right? Because it's the opposite of the trials and tribulations the desert can do upon you, okay? So Anubis would apparently come and get you when you died, according to the story. So he would come and collect you, and he was their angel of death. And the reason, a very, very important thing about his body is that he actually has a jackal for a face. What are jackals? Jackals are scavengers, right? So since a jackal is a scavenger, is the idea that Anubis is like a jackal because he comes and collects the dead, right? Much like actual jackals do or coyotes. Now, all of the ideas about this resurrection story are recorded in a very, very important book on a very, very important type of Egyptian paper. And that paper is known as papyrus, right? So this right here is a actual printing of what we believe the Egyptians believed about their afterlife, right? So you can actually see Anubis bringing a soul, this is a soul that had died, bringing it before this scale right here where your heart would be removed and put on this side of the scale and weighed against a feather of truth. The god scribe right here, Thoth, the god of writing and scribe work, would actually record your judgment, and then you would be brought in front of Osiris by Thoth, and you would be, by Horus, and you would be judged accordingly. And if you were good enough to go to the afterlife based on your past life, you would then go on to the happy field of food where the doors were behind Osiris. If you were judged not good enough to be going to the afterlife, you apparently were eaten by his pet alligator known as the Death Eater, and your soul was blinked out of existence, right? Now, all of this stuff, this judgment story, their mythology and everything else, heavily relates to this concept of resurrection, because remember, Isis pieced this guy, Osiris, back together out of his different parts. So the idea of being a connected human form in the afterlife is very important, and that's why King Tut looks so goofy and weird in this picture, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that stuff in class. We're going to talk about how mummification works, what they do with your body, what the point is, and stuff like that when we get back to class. And then we're going to talk some more Egyptian history stuff. But I'll talk to y'all when we get there.